They laughed as the mountain man was shamed. His next move. No one expected they laughed before anyone raised a hand, because laughter was safer than fists and just as effective. And the mountain man stood in the middle of the trading yard, with his coat still dusted from the trail, pack at his feet, eyes steady while the sound rolled around him like something practiced. Someone mocked the way he spoke. Someone else joked about how long he must have been alone to forget manners. A boy copied his posture and earned approval from men who liked cruelty better when it wore a smile. And the mountain man watched it without blinking, because reacting too quickly would give them the ending they wanted. The sheriff leaned against a post nearby, hat low, hands relaxed, treating the moment as harmless noise rather than a line being crossed. And the merchants pretended not to hear, because trade moved smoother when discomfort belonged to someone else. The mountain man had come down from the high country to sell pelts and salt meat, nothing more. But his presence alone unsettled people who preferred strength they could categorize. And when one man finally called him a relic, who should have stayed buried in the hills, the laughter sharpened, testing whether humiliation could be pushed further without consequence. He shifted his weight then, slow and deliberate, and the nearest voices faltered, because stillness unnerved them more than anger ever could. A hand tugged at his sleeve under the cover of humor, daring him to respond, and the mountain man turned his head and looked at the man plainly, not threatening, not forgiving, just present. And the look held long enough to thin the laughter into uncertainty. People watched closer now, sensing the edge where stories usually broke into violence, where the outsider proved the crowd right by answering shame with rage. The sheriff straightened slightly, ready at last, and hands drifted toward belts, because restraint made people nervous when they had prepared themselves for blood. The mountain man lifted his pack and set it down again with care, as if refusing to be rushed. And the simple act carried weight, because it suggested he was choosing something rather than reacting. He raised his eyes to the circle and spoke. Not loud, not defensive, saying he had lived long enough to know when noise was meant to hide fear, and that he had no interest in teaching grown men how to laugh at themselves. The words landed awkwardly, not sharp enough to wound and not soft enough to dismiss. And in that discomfort, the crowd felt the first crack, the realization that whatever came next would not be the punishment they had rehearsed, but something quieter and far more difficult to escape. The laughter thinned unevenly, not disappearing but losing confidence. And the mountain man felt the moment stretch as people waited for him to finish what they had started, because crowds preferred conclusions that confirmed their expectations. He did not oblige them. Instead, he loosened the straps of his pack and opened it where everyone could see, laying out his pelts one by one with the same care he used in the high country, smoothing fur with practiced hands as if trade, not humiliation, had always been the purpose of his descent. The normalcy of the action unsettled them more than anger would have, because it denied them the drama they had prepared to justify themselves afterward. A merchant hesitated, then stepped closer, curiosity winning over pride, and asked the price with a voice that carried less confidence than usual. The mountain man answered plainly, neither inflating nor conceding, refusing to bargain against insult as if the laughter had never happened. And that refusal shifted the ground under their feet. The sheriff cleared his throat, prepared to restore order now that the noise had turned uncertain. But the mountain man spoke first, saying he would trade with anyone willing to meet him without mockery, and that the rest were free to keep their laughter if they preferred it to business. The words were not a challenge, only an option laid bare, and options demanded choices. A man who had laughed earlier lingered at the edge, wrestling with whether to step forward or retreat. And when he finally asked if the mountain man would sell to someone who had been disrespectful, the question carried more weight than an apology would have. The mountain man looked at him for a long moment, long enough for the crowd to feel judgment gather, then said, "Trade was possible, but respect was not negotiable, and the man would have to decide which he valued more." The answer cut deeper than insult, because it placed responsibility back where it belonged. After a pause that felt longer than it was, the man removed his hat, a small gesture that cost him more than he expected. And the mountain man nodded once and named the price again, unchanged. The exchange drew others closer, drawn by the quiet authority of consistency. And soon the trading yard, filled with the ordinary sounds of business conducted without spectacle. The sheriff watched with a frown that softened into something like consideration. Realizing that control had been exercised without his permission and without force, and that the crowd was following an example rather than an order. As the mountain man completed one trade after another, the laughter became an embarrassment no one wanted to claim, and people found themselves standing straighter, speaking less, listening more, because dignity had been reintroduced to the space without announcement. By the time the sun shifted and shadows lengthened, the yard felt altered, not redeemed, but recalibrated. And those who remained understood that the mountain man had not taken the bait, because taking it would have made the laughter necessary. Instead, he had made it irrelevant. And that was the move no one had expected. The trading yard did not return to its old rhythm right away, because old rhythms depended on noise that no longer felt safe to repeat. And the mountain man sensed the shift even as he kept his attention on the work in front of him, weighing pelts and counting coin with the steady patience that had carried him through winters no one in town could imagine. People spoke more carefully now, testing their words before letting them loose, and the absence of laughter hung heavier than mockery ever had, because silence invited reflection, whether it was wanted or not. A woman approached with a basket of flour and dried apples, offering a fair exchange without ceremony. And when the mountain man accepted and thanked her, the simplicity of it felt corrective, like a wrong quietly set right in public. The sheriff moved closer, not to intervene but to observe, aware that the yard had reordered itself without instruction, and the realization unsettled him, because authority that depended on timing had arrived late. A boy who had mimicked the mountain man earlier stood near his father now, eyes downcast, and when the mountain man caught his glance, he did not scowl or forgive, only nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged the boy's presence without shaming him. And the child straightened as if relieved of a weight he had not known how to carry. Men who had laughed loudest found themselves speaking less, uncertain where the line had moved and afraid to cross it again, while others felt emboldened by the new tone, stepping forward with questions about routes and weather that treated the mountain man as a source of knowledge rather than a spectacle. He answered when asked and stayed quiet when he wasn't, refusing to fill the space for them, and that restraint forced the crowd to supply its own meaning. The sheriff finally spoke, saying the business should proceed and the day move on. But the words sounded redundant now, because the day had already chosen its direction. As the afternoon wore on, the mountain man finished his last trade and tied his pack closed. And a small ripple of attention followed the motion, not anticipation of conflict, but awareness that something had concluded without being resolved in the usual way. He shouldered the pack and turned toward the road, and a few people stepped aside to clear a path, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the moment deserved space. No one applauded and no one jeered. The yard held a thoughtful hush that felt earned rather than enforced. When the mountain man walked out of the circle and toward the edge of town, he did so without looking back, trusting the quiet to do its work. And those who remained understood that the laughter had failed not because it had been punished, but because it had been outgrown in public, replaced by a discomfort that would follow them home and ask harder questions than mockery ever had. The mountain man did not leave town immediately, and that decision unsettled people more than his departure would have, because it denied them the relief of distance and forced them to live alongside the change they had felt but not named. He camped just beyond the last buildings, where the ground rose slightly and the wind cut clean, close enough to be seen and far enough to keep his solitude intact. And the settlement adjusted around that fact in small, telling ways. Men who would have crossed the street to avoid him the day before now glanced toward the rise and then away, unsure whether to approach or pretend they hadn't noticed. While women sent children on errands that passed near his camp, curiosity and caution sharing the same path. The sheriff rode by once at a measured pace, eyes forward, not stopping and not ignoring, as if restraint had become the lesson he was still learning to practice. That night, talk gathered in kitchens and back rooms, some insisting the mountain man's calm had been a kind of trick. Others admitting they had never seen shame handled without fists and didn't know what to do with the feeling it left behind. By morning, a man arrived at the camp with a cracked canteen and a question about weather in the high country, speaking stiffly, prepared to be dismissed. And the mountain man answered him plainly, refilling the canteen without comment, because usefulness had always been his preferred language. The exchange traveled faster than the laughter had, carried by tone rather than spectacle. And before noon, 2 more men approached with small needs. A mule shoe that wouldn't hold, a root washed out by spring melt. And each time the mountain man responded with the same quiet competence, never referencing the day before, and never accepting apology as currency. The crowd watched from a distance, realizing that dignity extended over time was harder to argue with than dignity claimed in a moment. A boy appeared near the camp again, lingering at the edge until the mountain man acknowledged him. And when he asked how to set a snare properly, the mountain man showed him without lecture, hands steady, voice low, and the lesson carried an implication that cut deeper than reprimand. Respect was taught by example, not demanded. As afternoon settled, the town felt a subtle pressure shift, not toward agreement, but toward accountability, because returning to old habits now required effort. The mountain man packed his camp slowly as the light changed, giving the settlement one more day to decide how it would remember him. And when he finally turned toward the trail, he did not look back, trusting that the test had already been administered. Those who watched understood that what mattered was not whether they approved of him, but whether they could return to laughter, knowing what restraint had cost and what it had revealed. And that knowledge, once earned, was not easily set down. By the second afternoon, the town had learned where the new line sat, not drawn in chalk or enforced by threat, but felt in the way people paused before speaking and measured their humor before letting it loose. The mountain man returned to the trading yard briefly, not to sell, but to pass through. And the change met him halfway. Conversations lowered, shoulders turned, space opened without being asked for. A merchant greeted him with a nod that was neither friendly nor dismissive, simply correct. And the mountain man answered in kind, accepting the small adjustment as the work it was. The sheriff watched from the boardwalk, noting how order now arrived earlier, before he had reason to step in, and the realization weighed on him because it meant authority could be shared without being surrendered. A man who had mocked him the first day tried to joke again with his companions, testing the air, and the joke fell flat, met with silence that felt heavier than rebuke. because the crowd had learned what laughter cost when it chose the wrong target. The man flushed and turned away, embarrassed not by punishment, but by the absence of approval. And the mountain man did not look at him, understanding that correction had already occurred. A woman approached with a question about a trail that cut through the hills, and when the mountain man answered, he did so with practical detail, speaking of water and shade and the places where snow lingered late, and people nearby listened with interest that had nothing to do with spectacle. Children edged closer, curiosity replacing fear, and the mountain man kept his voice even, refusing to perform wisdom or demand respect, letting competence speak for itself. The yard continued its business around him, and the lack of reaction became its own signal, teaching without instruction. When he left again, no one followed and no one called out. But the quiet felt different now, less tense and more intentional, as if the town had agreed, without meeting or vote, that dignity would not be treated as entertainment again. The mountain man walked toward the edge of town with the steady pace of someone who knew when work was finished, carrying with him not approval or apology, but a shift that would test the crowd long after he was gone, because lines that moved once could move again. And everyone who had witnessed it understood that where they stood next time would be a choice, not an accident. The town did not congratulate itself for changing, and that was the truest sign that something real had taken place. Because comfort would have meant forgetting too quickly, and forgetting was the habit that had made the laughter easy in the first place. The mountain man's presence lingered even when he was not visible, settling into conversations that stopped short of mockery and into silences that felt heavier than before, as if people had learned that words, once spoken, could not always be reclaimed. Men who had laughed avoided one another's eyes when the moment was mentioned, each uncertain how much responsibility he carried alone and how much belonged to the crowd. And that uncertainty kept the wound open in a way punishment never could. The sheriff found himself stepping in sooner when jokes edged toward cruelty, not because rules demanded it, but because he recognized the moment now, the precise second when humor turned into license. And he understood too late how often he had allowed that second to pass. A merchant refused a crude jest from a customer and surprised himself by doing so, feeling the decision settle awkwardly but firmly. And the refusal traveled faster than gossip, carried by tone rather than story. Children repeated fragments of what they had seen, not the laughter, but the calm, telling one another about the man who didn't get angry when everyone expected him to. And parents listened with a discomfort that suggested the lesson was landing where it could not be corrected away. Not everyone accepted the change. A few men hardened against it, muttering that the town had gone soft, that restraint was weakness dressed up as virtue. And they looked for allies who would agree loudly enough to drown the doubt. But even among them, the laughter came slower, because the memory of being seen had not faded. The mountain man passed through once more at dusk, not stopping, only nodding to those who met his eye. And the nod was returned without hesitation, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than apology. As night settled, the settlement moved with a carefulness it had not known before. Not because it feared consequence, but because it had learned recognition. The unsettling awareness that dignity could not be taken lightly once it had been defended in public. The discomfort remained, unresolved and uneven, but it did its work quietly, reminding each person that cruelty required permission and that permission could be withdrawn, not by force, but by choosing, again and again, not to laugh when laughter asked for the wrong price. By the third day, the mountain man's name had stopped being a rumor and started being a reference. the way a standard quietly forms when people need something to compare themselves against. And he felt the shift without seeking it, because attention had changed from curiosity to consideration. He moved through the edge of town to resupply, keeping his distance from the trading yard. And people noticed the restraint in that too, the way he refused to linger where he might be turned into a story again. A rancher asked him about a broken gate and listened carefully to the answer, surprised by how direct it was, free of instruction or judgment. And when the fix worked the next morning, the result spoke louder than any apology could have. The sheriff crossed his path near the livery and nodded first this time, a small reversal that did not erase the past, but acknowledged it. And the mountain man returned the nod without ceremony, because victory was not what he had come to collect. A woman thanked him quietly for the way things had changed for her children at school, for the jokes that no longer landed the same way. And he answered that change held only if it was practiced, not praised. And the simplicity of the response made it harder to set aside. Men who had bristled earlier watched from a distance, measuring whether restraint was contagious or merely inconvenient, and found that the absence of mockery had made space for other kinds of talk, about weather, about roots, about work, conversations that did not require someone else to be smaller. As afternoon thinned, the mountain man prepared to leave for good, tightening straps and checking the sky with the habit of someone who trusted conditions more than schedules. And a few people gathered at a respectful distance, not to see him off, but to witness themselves choosing differently. No speeches were made, no gestures were demanded. The town simply held its ground in a new way, quieter and more attentive, and the mountain man accepted that as the only proof that mattered. When he set out toward the trail, his back straight and pace unhurried, the measure he left behind was not how he had endured shame, but how little he had needed to answer it. And those who watched understood that strength had been redefined without being announced, a standard set not by force or forgiveness, but by the steady refusal to become what a crowd expected. The real test came when the mountain man was no longer the focus, when attention drifted and the town was left alone with itself, because it was easier to behave while being watched than it was to choose restraint when no one seemed to be measuring. A joke surfaced near the saloon that afternoon, careless and familiar, aimed at a newcomer who did not yet know where the lines had shifted. And for a moment the old rhythm tried to return, laughter hovering on the edge of release. Then it stalled. One man glanced toward the trading yard out of habit and found it empty. Another cleared his throat and looked away. The joke fell to the ground unfinished, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any rebuke, because it belonged to them alone. No sheriff stepped in. No mountain man stood nearby to remind them what dignity looked like. The pause was theirs, and in that pause the crowd learned something uncomfortable, that cruelty needed agreement to survive, and agreement could be withdrawn without announcement. A woman changed the subject. A merchant shook his head once, subtle but clear. The newcomer laughed awkwardly and let the moment pass, sensing the shift without understanding it. And the day moved on, altered in ways that could not be explained easily later. The sheriff heard about it secondhand and said nothing, recognizing that authority had not been required this time. And the realization unsettled him because it meant responsibility had moved outward. Children noticed too, repeating the half-joke at home and being met not with laughter, but with correction that did not scold, only redirected. And the lesson took root quietly. Not everyone welcomed it. A few men complained that the town felt tense, that people were watching their words too closely now. And they blamed the mountain man's presence for discomfort that had no clear target. But even among them the laughter came slower, because something had been lost. the cover of the crowd, the ease of hiding inside noise. By evening, the settlement settled into itself with a new awareness. Not kinder in every way, not suddenly just, but changed enough to matter. The mountain man's choice had stripped away an excuse the town had relied on, and without it, people were left to decide who they were when no one was being shamed to entertain them. When the mountain man finally disappeared into the high trail beyond the trees, the town felt quieter than it ever had before. Not because noise had stopped, but because something that once justified it was gone. Work continued. Wagons creaked, doors opened and shut. Yet the rhythm carried a hesitation that hadn't existed before, as if every word now passed through a second thought before being released. Men who once relied on the comfort of shared laughter found themselves speaking less, unsure who would join in, and that uncertainty followed them through the day like a shadow that refused to lift. The sheriff noticed it most clearly when he walked the main street and found no trouble waiting for him. Not because people were afraid, but because they were watching themselves instead. Authority had not been challenged directly, but it had been quietly outpaced by example, and the realization left him uneasy in a way force never had. At the store, a merchant corrected a customer who tried to revive an old joke. Not sharply, just enough to stop it. And the correction landed without argument because no one wanted to be the one who insisted on returning to something that no longer felt safe. In homes, the story of the mountain man was told in pieces, rarely the same way twice. Some framing him as proud, others as strange, but all circling the same truth without naming it. That he had endured shame without allowing it to define him. Children absorbed the lesson differently, reenacting the stillness more than the laughter, standing silently in games where shouting used to rule, and parents watched with an unease that hinted at recognition. Not everyone accepted the change. A few men hardened against it, claiming the town had grown fragile, that humor was being policed by discomfort rather than law. And they spoke among themselves in lowered voices, testing whether resentment could still gather strength. But even there, something faltered, because they had felt the moment when mockery failed, and memory made repetition harder. Days passed, and the mountain man became a reference rather than a presence, invoked not as a threat, but as a measure, and people adjusted without admitting they were doing so. The trading yard resumed its business, quieter and more deliberate. And when differences appeared, they were handled with less spectacle. Not because the town had become better, but because it had become aware. By the end of the week, the laughter that once came easily required effort, and effort made it optional. What remained after the mountain man left was not agreement or peace, but responsibility, settled unevenly across shoulders that could no longer claim ignorance, and that weight, once felt, did not disappear simply because the one who revealed it had moved on. What people remembered later was not the laughter or even the silence that followed it, but the choice the mountain man made when he could have claimed something from them and didn't, because expectation had prepared them for demand, not restraint. In the days after he left, some waited for consequence, for retaliation delayed, for a return that would turn example into judgment. And when none came, the absence itself began to teach. The mountain man did not send word back to town. He did not speak of the moment to others on the trail. He did not let the story follow him like proof of endurance, and that refusal unsettled those who had hoped their discomfort might be eased by explanation or forgiveness. Without a response to react against, the crowd was left with only its own behavior to measure, and that proved harder to escape than any confrontation. the sheriff found that his authority felt different now. Not weakened, but exposed. Because people watched him more closely in moments where humor edged toward harm, and stepping in late no longer felt sufficient. Merchants noticed that trade moved smoother when dignity was assumed rather than negotiated. And though profit had never demanded cruelty, it had often tolerated it. And the tolerance no longer came easily. Children carried the clearest version of the lesson forward, repeating not what had been said, but what had been done, telling one another about the man who did nothing when everyone expected something loud. And in their games, stillness began to mean strength rather than defeat. Not every heart softened. Some hardened instead, choosing resentment over reflection, insisting that the town had been shamed in return. But even they spoke more carefully, because they knew now how visible laughter could become once it failed. Weeks later, when another outsider passed through and the old instinct stirred, the pause arrived sooner, cutting off mockery before it could gather, and people recognized the moment for what it was, the echo of a choice made earlier, still working its way outward. No one named the mountain man then. They did not need to. The unexpected move he had made was not restraint alone, but departure without triumph, leaving behind no debt to repay and no story to correct, only a mirror that stayed. And in that mirror, the crowd learned that power did not always belong to the one who answered shame the loudest, but to the one who refused to carry it any further, forcing everyone else to decide what they would do with what remained. If you had been standing there, would you have laughed with the crowd or stayed silent? Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Western American tales.